Hello beautiful people, my name is Laurier and welcome to my channel Old Dirty History, where I like to talk about whatever historic topic, person, place, or thing that I want to talk about. And today I want to talk about human experimentation throughout history, something that has always intrigued me, but I've never really done a deep dive into with my research. I'm excited. It's no secret that human experimentation has contributed to our current advancements in medicine and science. We've all benefited from human experimentation, whether it's through a medicine that you took, a surgery that you had, or a food you ate. You get the idea. However, some of these experiments took place without the subject's knowledge or under duress. And I want to talk about some of those human experiments today. Of course, I'm not going to do a deep dive into every single human experiment that took place under the sun throughout history. We'd be here all day if I did that. And while some of the experiments I'm going to talk about are pretty well known, maybe you've heard of them, maybe you haven't. I hope you take away something new today that you didn't know a few minutes ago. But if there is a human experiment that I don't discuss in this video that you want to mention in the comments, please do. Because this is such a heavy topic, I do want to give a disclaimer and then we'll go ahead and get straight into the video. Some of the topics that I'm going to discuss and the images I'll use in this video are very graphic in nature, and it may be a bit disturbing for some folks to look at. So if this isn't your jam, I totally understand, but please feel free to check out one of my other videos. I got some videos that have nothing to do with this sort of thing, like this one. This is a really good video if you haven't checked it out. But if you want to continue with me and talk about human experimentation, all the horrible things that human beings have done to one another, then let's get into it. On June 6 in 1822, a Canadian voyager named Alexis St. Martin was accidentally shot close range by a musket at a fur trading post in Mackinac Island, Michigan. This shot left a hole in his side that tore right through the wall of his stomach. Miraculously, he survived this horrible accident, but what's really weird about St. Martin's case is that as he got better from the accident, his hole never healed. It just stayed there. And so it was really weird because when St. Martin would try to eat food, the food would just leak right on out the hole in the side of his stomach. So in order to get some type of sustenance that remained in his body, he had to receive what they called nutritional enemas.
Free goo.
That was until his hole healed enough to the point where they could put a bandage over it to block the hole off so that his food would stay in when he ate it through his mouth, not his butt. Stuff got really weird when 37-year-old Army surgeon William Beaumont was stationed at Fort Mackinac at the time of the accident, and he began to examine the wound in St. Martin's body. He treated the wound as best as he could, but he assumed that St. Martin was a goner until he survived and got well, and to his surprise, the hole was still there. After Beaumont witnessed St. Martin eating and the food leaking out of his stomach, he came up with this brilliant idea. He would use St. Martin's misfortune as an opportunity to study digestion. He had the perfect little window or hole into his gut that would serve as a great way to observe the entire event every time St. Martin ate something. Because at this time, very little was known about digestion, and so Beaumont was extremely curious. But the way he went about it was really messed up. For starters, Beaumont would stick food into the hole in St. Martin's body, and then he would pull it out for observation. So he would tie the food to a string and he would just drop it into the hole, just let it, cook, bake for 10 minutes, flip it, bake for another, pull it out, and he would look at it. Ew. It gets even more messed up. Beaumont didn't just stick food into St. Martin's gut. No, he put all kinds of weird foreign objects in this man's stomach. He put spoons, thermometers, whatever he could think of, he stuck in this man's stomach. He carried out these experiments with St. Martin for 10 years. Imagine having somebody put stuff into your gut hole for 10 years. Even though Beaumont used St. Martin to fuel his own curiosity, he would describe St. Martin as this worthless alcoholic, and the only thing he was good for was what contributions his stomach hole could make towards science. How messed up is that? He would refer to St. Martin as a villain, a drunkard, just completely worthless. Oh, and of all things, he would call him ungrateful. Beaumont also showed very little care for St. Martin's well-being and his health. He could care less. And he would also try to find various ways to keep St. Martin close so that he could continue these experiments throughout that decade. So like he hired him as well as his family as hired hands for his household so that they could have some form of income and he could keep them close. Pretty much a job opportunity to keep them there. He even had St. Martin enlist in the army so that he could collect a stipend to continue to support himself financially as he laid in his home and allowed this man to drop this foreign shit into his stomach. But in the end, St. Martin would get the last laugh because he would actually outlive Beaumont despite his gut hole. Prior to Beaumont's experiments, there were a lot of debates in the medical community as to whether or not digestion was a chemical or a mechanical process. And thanks to Beaumont and his unethical experiments on St. Martin, he was able to confirm that it was in fact chemical. But at what cost? Sims was a 19th century antebellum doctor who was known for developing a surgical technique for repairing vesicovaginal fistulas. I did not know what vesicovaginal fistulas was until I did research on this experiment, which is definitely at the top for me of worst experiments of all time. It's pretty bad. I would not wish this on my worst enemy. This devastating condition can occur as a complication from childbirth as a result of prolonged obstructed labor. What happens is an abnormal opening forms between the bladder and the genitals that leads to issues controlling urination, and it can cause tissue necrosis, which is when the flesh dies. It dies completely. There's no reviving it. It's dead. From my understanding of this condition after doing research on it, it literally forces women to live in their own excrement. It's devastating. And it's just a horrible existence. It's not a good way to live. It's not a common issue today because of these experiments that Sims did that I'm about to talk about. But when it was common, it was just horrible. I made the mistake of looking up pictures of this disease. I want to save you. Please don't. I cannot help you if you do this and it gets stuck in your memory for the rest of your life and haunts you. I made that mistake. I'm just trying to help you out. Don't make the same mistake as I did. While this procedure that Sims discovered changed the lives of countless women, the means he took to create this procedure, it's just horrible. From 1846 to 1849, Sims carried out experiments to develop and perfect his technique on enslaved Black women. Yes, you heard right. His human subjects were only Black enslaved women. The purpose of his experiments were to try to find an efficient way to close the fistulas and keep it closed, because the problem was he would try and they would pop open. To obtain his patients, really victims, he borrowed anywhere from 11 to 17 enslaved Black women from some local slave owners he knew. And during their time as his subjects, he was responsible for their lodging and other expenses. Some were even trained to help him carry out these procedures on other enslaved women. Over the course of 3 years, Sims operated on them, back to back. In a book Sims wrote, he claims he performed these procedures in a makeshift operating room he put together in his backyard. Imagine somebody in his backyard. And it gets worse. He would sometimes have an audience while he operated on these women. Just imagine just being eagle-wide, just spread out in some man's backyard who you don't know like that. There's a crowd watching him. Can't even begin. He would continuously try over and over again to find a successful way to close their fistulas, but they would always reopen. There are reports of him attempting this procedure on some of the women up to 30 times. And remember, this is over the course of 3 years. And Sims would not stop until he found a successful way to close the fistulas and keep them closed. Another aspect of the way that Sims carried out these experiments that has caused a lot of controversy is the fact that he did not use anesthesia on any of the women during these procedures. At the time of these experiments, ether was available as an anesthetic. There are a few speculations, because that's what they are, they're speculations, amongst historians and medical experts as to why he did not use anesthesia on his patients. Some of them say that he didn't use it because he felt like the procedure was not painful enough to warrant any form of anesthesia, which I'm telling you right now as a woman, bump that, okay? You're closing up a hole that's near my other holes. I'm sorry, I don't mean to, okay, that's a little too graphic. I'm sorry. You're closing up a hole that don't belong there on my body in a very sensitive area, and you're telling me that it's not painful enough to warrant me being knocked out? Sir, try closing a hole that's near your... Some speculate it's because anesthesia was still relatively new. The first successful case of anesthesia being used in surgery that was a successful operation didn't occur until 1846. So this was right when he started the experiments. So the whole idea of using anesthesia while operating was still new. And so some experts and historians think that he didn't want to use it on his patients because he didn't trust it. He didn't know enough about it. And there were stories or reports of complications occurring from using ether during surgeries where patients died. So instead, what Sims did was he gave his patients copious amounts of morphine or opium. And so there were reports of some of the women becoming drug addicts. And of course, because of all of this controversy, there's been a lot of debates as to whether or not Sims should be seen as a hero of women or a disgusting racist who took advantage of enslaved women, a man who defiled the bodies of Black women against their will. Some of the arguments that are made by supporters of Sims are based on the accounts that he recorded from when he did these experiments. The problem with this is that even when you have a primary source, let's say Sims wrote a letter about what he did himself in his hand, it doesn't mean that it's true. I could write down a lie right now, fold it up, put it in a drawer, have somebody find it 200 years from now. Doesn't mean that it's fact. That person will never know if I was telling the truth or not. And it works the same way with Sims. Just because he might have said that he did things a certain way or this was his reasoning behind that, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. And some historians believe that Sims tried to downplay the severity of the experiments and the procedures that these women had undergone. We weren't there, so obviously we'll never know for certain. Some people argue that Sims' subjects may have been willing participants. And this is because they were physically suffering from the condition, and so they must have been desperate to have somebody fix it, because this condition was really bad. It got so bad for some of these women that they actually would commit suicide. And so the argument is that these women were so desperate to receive some form of medical attention for their condition that they were willing to have this stranger operate on them in order to find a way to cure them. But here's my response to this theory. If these women were so willing because they realized that they were so privileged to have this man operate on them up to 30 times within a short period of time, what if these women said no? What if these enslaved Black women said to their masters, to their owners, no, I am not letting this man operate on me. I don't want anything to do with this. No, thank you. What would have happened? Would Dr. Sims have respected their wishes? I'm a little doubtful. My other question is, if these women were so privileged to have Sims experiment on their bodies, then why did he not put out an ad for any woman? White woman, black woman, brown woman, light-skinned woman, free woman, to allow him to experiment on them. Why? If this was such a privilege, why is that? Because don't nobody in their right mind want somebody operating on them back to back to back. I don't care how severe the condition is, unless this was like a procedure that was established from the jump and it was going to be a done deal. And of course somebody's going to be like, hell yeah. But this man was experimenting on these women. This wasn't a treatment plan that was guaranteed. Come on. And obviously what we do know is that Sims was a man of his location. He was an antebellum doctor. He lived in the Carolinas, okay? I'm not going to sit here and pretend like racism was not rampant in the South in the mid-19th century. We're not going to do that. I'm not going to sit here and say that white people who lived in the South that were anti-slavery didn't exist. I'm not going to say that, but it wasn't a common thing. And the fact that he openly thought, slaves, that's it, enslaved women, I'll go straight to that idea. I'm pretty sure the way that Sims saw Black people, especially enslaved Black people, in relation to whites, played a role in his selection process for this human experiment. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Services started an experiment in Macon County, Alabama, to observe the effects of untreated syphilis on the human body, and this experiment is known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. The human subjects the U.S. government used for this experiment were a total of 400 African American men who were diagnosed with syphilis, and a total of 200 African American men who weren't diagnosed, and they were all from the surrounding area. The problem with this experiment is that when penicillin became a known treatment for people suffering from syphilis in 1943, and the US government denied this information and this drug from these human subjects, that's when we got a problem. Instead, they decided to allow syphilis to run rampant in these men's bodies so that they could observe the effects of syphilis up until someone's death. And I have to mention that during this time, racist ideologies saw Black people as lower than white people, obviously, but what that also included was from a medical standpoint, from an evolutionary standpoint. This way of thinking was so ingrained into the way some racist people thought that it literally made its way into the Dewey Decimal System originally. Look it up. I'm not lying. I swear to God, I'm a librarian. I'm telling you the truth. And so I have no doubt in my mind that this way of thinking played a role in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. It wasn't until 1972, when the study made its way to the public, that the experiment was finally shut down. Throughout the experiments, at least 28, but potentially more than 100 men died due to the advanced stages of syphilis, which is a horrible, horrible, slow, painful death. And the reason why there's such a huge number gap is because when governments don't want the public to know something, they'll try to hide as much as possible. And so we're left to our own devices to try to calculate roughly how many people were negatively impacted and how many people died as a result of these experiments. Throughout these experiments, these men were told that they had bad blood, a local term that was used to describe a variety of ailments. In exchange for their involvement in the study, these men were given free meals, free medical exams, and burial insurance. Great deal. These Black sharecroppers believed that the people they entrusted their care with were helping them this whole time, but instead they were just giving them placebo pills and studying the effects syphilis had on their bodies as the disease slowly killed them. In 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the participants and their families. They were awarded $10 million in an out-of-court settlement in 1974, but that will never make up for the horrors that these men went through. This next one is rough. And I'm not sensitive to morbid events in history or morbid movies. I love horror movies, and I love to learn about the darker side of history just because I do have a morbid curiosity, I have to be honest. But this one right here is a tough one, even for somebody like myself. And what I'm talking about are the experiments that took place at Ishi's Unit 731. Biological warfare is not a secret. We've heard about it throughout history time and time again. And it's no exception for the Japanese during World War II. Japanese medical officer and doctor Shiro Ishii led numerous atrocious experiments in a prison camp located in Manchuria, China, and it was called Unit 731. After the 1925 Geneva Protocol banned the use of bacteriological and chemical weapons in war, Ishii became an advocate for Japan creating their own bacteriological weapons program. Because in Ishii's mind, he thought, well, if they don't want us to have it, then, it must be good. And so Ishii eventually got exactly what he wanted, which was a secret biological warfare research facility in the Chinese province of Manchuria, where he could execute his nefarious experiments on Chinese men, women, and children. He was able to conduct these experiments in Manchuria because the Japanese had just invaded the area the previous year. You see, Chinese lives did not matter to Ishii or his comrades at all. To him, they were the perfect human test subjects for his horrible experiments. This facility was a prison. It was made up of 150 buildings that were surrounded by high voltage wires, a wall, and a dry moat. Here are some of the horrific experiments that took place in Unit 731. Because winters were very harsh in China, it was very difficult for Japanese soldiers to navigate through their terrain. The Japanese were also talking about hopefully potentially invading Russia, and as you already know, Russia gets really freaking cold, especially in specific areas. And so frostbite was a major concern for them. So they wanted to find a way to protect their soldiers, to, I guess, make them invincible to frostbite. So they conducted experiments on human subjects with frostbite, even though we already know what frostbite does to the human body. They tied subjects outside in freezing cold temperatures. I'm talking below 0 degrees, with their arms and hands exposed to the elements. They would then pour water over their limbs until they completely froze. And then they would use various methods to thaw their limbs. And of course, their limbs would be dead. And so from that point, what they would do is, if they wanted to continue experimenting on this person, they would save them by chopping off, by amputating that limb. If they didn't want to continue experimenting on that person, they would leave the dead limb attached to their body and watch them slowly die. In addition to frostbite experiments, horse urine was injected into people's kidneys. Like, horse urine? What did they think was going to happen from that? Like, bruh, what are you thinking? They would replace human plasma with horse plasma to watch its effects. People were hung upside down to see how long it would take them to die. Some were put into compression chambers and forced to endure high pressures until their intestines erupted. Women were also sexually abused by employees. And when a child was born from these horrific crimes, even the babies were experimented on. Their little bodies were vivisected while they were still alive. I told you, this one was rough. It was rough. There are 2 rules that I have when it comes to watching horror movies or books or just anything. It's the harm of children and of animals. In my eyes, they are the most innocent creatures on this planet. I'm not a big child person, okay? I don't have children. I got a nephew, he's about it, and I got 2 dogs. Those are my babies. Though I don't have kids, like they're children. So this was a really hard one for me to research. One employee actually testified that he was going to a female prisoner until he saw that her genitals had gangrene. That's how foul and horrible it was in this facility. It was literally hell on earth. And of course, they also conducted experiments with bacteria and diseases. Some prisoners were injected with diseases and chemicals directly into their bloodstreams. Stuff like plague, typhoid, cholera, and anthrax. Some of them were forced to drink milk with cholera in it or eat food that was laced with anthrax. fucks. And these sick fucks would actually torture their victims up until their last breath. So instead of waiting for them to die or just taking them out of their misery, they would dissect them while they were still actively alive so that they could observe the effects of whatever they did, whatever chemical or disease they put in them, on the body actively while they were still living. Once they perfected their diseases, they decided, you know what, we really want to see them active in like a population instead of just seeing the disease do its thing on an individual. So what did they decide to do? They decided to infect rats with plague for millions of fleas to feast off of, and then these fleas would then carry the disease to unsuspecting people and livestock. Here's a picture of the area where they bred the rats to infect the surrounding Chinese population. Just sick, just awful. Now get ready to be really angry. I mean really, really angry. In exchange for what they gathered from their research, the US government protected the scientists involved with Unit 731 from the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. They even went as far as employing some of these scientists in the US's biological warfare program. Honestly, after how they handled the Nazis, I'm really not surprised. Victims of Unit 731 have attempted to sue the Japanese government for several years. Every single case was lost. Joseph Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death, conducted cruel and despicable experiments on countless men, women, and children in Nazi concentration camps during World War II. Those who were selected to be part of Mengele's horrific experiments lived in separate barracks within the concentration camps, and they were temporarily spared from the gas chamber compared to their peers, but once Mengele deemed them no longer useful, they were sent to their deaths. That is, if the experiment did not kill them beforehand. These experiments were rooted in racism. The Germans were obsessed with the idea of the perfect German race, and so supposedly these experiments centered around creating a perfect German race and increasing their race. And so Mengele was very obsessed with hair color and eye color because, as you probably already know, the Nazis' ideal human had blue eyes and blonde hair. Mengele would inject germs into the bodies of his victims, and he would sit back and observe its effects. He would also do experiments on blood loss to see how much blood could be taken out of a person before they died. This sick piece of crap. He even experimented on a 7-year-old girl by connecting her urinary tract to her colon. What the hell did he expect to accomplish from this? I do not know. He would also attempt to make male children female and female children male, going as far as castrating little boys. Of all the sick shit that Mengele was interested in, he was by far most intrigued by twins. He was obsessed with twins. This monster would sew twins together, connecting their blood vessels and organs in an attempt to create a Siamese twin. One Holocaust survivor who was a twin recounted her experience in Mengele's horrible experiments and listening to the screams of twins crying all night and day from this horrific experiment until they died from gangrene after 3 days of torture. Of an estimated 1,000 pairs of twins, only 200 pairs survived by the end of the Holocaust. Gotta talk about MK Ultra. We cannot do a human experimentation video without including MK Ultra. Project MK Ultra was the code name for a mind control human experiment research program that was created by the CIA in the 1950s. It was conducted from 1953 to 1964, supposedly. Some people say that the project is still going on today. The CIA was able to keep the experiment hush-hush until a civilian army employee named Dr. Frank Olson jumped to his death from a hotel room window in New York City after being given LSD without his knowledge. I'm not trying to make light of this horrible event, but I'm going to tell you right now, if I was secretly given a dose of LSD without my knowledge, my panic attack, anxiety riddled ass would be a mess. Like, I can't even begin to picture it. I'd probably be the next Florida man. Y'all see me on TV butt naked eating somebody's face off. The project was led by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb under the order of CIA Director Allen Dulles, and it started on April 13th in 1953. The project was claimed to be in response to allegations of the Soviets, Chinese, and North Koreans using mind control techniques on U.S. prisoners of war. A report on MK-Ultra from 1963 revealed that the CIA tested drugs on U.S. citizens unknowingly or unwillingly. MK-Ultra was actually an umbrella project that consisted of numerous sub-projects. I think it's 149 of them existed, but all of them were connected in some way to researching behavioral modification, drug acquisition and testing, and administering drugs to human subjects. There were a wide array of experiments that took place within MK-Ultra. Some of them included using radiation as a means for mind control, which I'm like, how did you see that working out? How did you make that connection? There was also a lot of LSD. I'm talking copious amounts of LSD. Everybody was doing it. Even the people in the CIA, the people in charge, LSD everywhere. They go to work, LSD. They come home, LSD. Eat dinner, LSD. Go on vacation, LSD. They would also administer the drug to military personnel, sex workers, mentally ill patients, and the general public. Gottlieb would sometimes torture his subjects, by placing them into a sensory deprivation chamber while under the influence of LSD. What? All right, if you don't know what a sensory deprivation chamber is, it's literally an environment that you're encased in where you hear, feel, smell, touch nothing. All your senses are underused. They're underappreciated in this environment. Being on a drug like LSD, when you're in an environment where your senses are not being utilized at all, hear me when I say no. Some people within the program did give their consent to be on LSD, and some of these people were put on it for 69 consecutive days. And if you have this romanticized version of these people on LSD, like it's like loves and flowers, no, there was none of that. It was more like another experiment they did was injecting barbiturates into a subject's arm, and then they would inject amphetamines into the other arm. And how they did it is just really cruel. So they would inject the barbiturates, and then as soon as the person would start to fall asleep, because it's a downer, they would, I don't know nothing about that, I'm sorry, but I believe it's a downer since they're falling asleep. Once they fell asleep, they would inject them with amphetamines, which is an upper, and I can only imagine the effect this probably has on mental stability, the heart. I can't even begin to imagine it. This specific experiment was shut down when one of their subjects died, not surprisingly. They also experimented with heroin, mescaline, scopolamine, weed, alcohol, and many other drugs. This experiment ruined several lives, several family members of their victims, and the negative impact of this experiment can still be found today. The next experiment on our list is the Aversion Project, an abomination to humanity. This experiment took place in apartheid South Africa from 1971 to 1989 in an attempt to cure homosexuality. These experiments were executed by the South African Defense Force at a high security military facility called this. I'm not even gonna try to pronounce this. This is what it was called. You can do it yourself. In 1967, the South African military adopted universal conscription, which is mandatory enlistment into the military. And those who were conscripted were screened for homosexuality. How you do that? I do not know. Initially, they only targeted men who they suspected as being homosexual, but eventually they would target women as well. And if these citizens did not agree to this screening, they were imprisoned. Once they were screened and deemed to be homosexual, they were taken to this secretive area called Ward 22 within the military hospital. Within this ward, human subjects were subjected to electric shock against their will. And so what they would do is they would show black and white images of naked men, and then if they responded in an aroused way, they would electrocute them. And then afterwards, they would show them a Playboy centerfold. And so this was a way to try to instill a sense of this is being gay is bad, you're gonna get electrocuted. Being heterosexual is good. The whole thing is just sick. Aversion therapy has been used for other things like quitting smoking and quitting drugs, things like that, but it's also been used for messed up stuff like this. One person reported witnessing a human subject experiencing a shock that was so severe that the subject's shoes flew clear off of their feet. Some of their victims were also chemically castrated using hormones. There's also reports of anywhere from 50 to 900 men and women being forced to receive gender reassignment surgery. Again, huge disparity in range of numbers because the government is trying to hide it. And so people have to do the best they can trying to figure out how many people were negatively affected by the government's actions. Many of their victims died during these gender reassignment surgeries, and those who received forced hormone treatment were discharged, kicked out on the streets without any access to these hormones because they were expensive and they can't afford them. And so now they're living as a gender that they were forced to adopt, and they're expected to maintain this appearance, but without the hormone treatment, they can't. And so this had a horrible psychological effect on a lot of these poor people. Their identities were taken from them. And so some of these people committed suicide. Some of them didn't even finish receiving gender reassignment surgery. These experiments were led by a man named Dr. Aubrey Levin, a South African doctor who would eventually relocate to Canada, where he would, brace yourself, become the head of the psychiatric department at the University of Calgary. He would only serve 5 years in prison, but not for the aversion project. No. This guy was sick. His sick actions did not stop in South Africa. While living in Canada, he became a medical practitioner for a jail in Calgary. While there, he sexually assaulted several inmates under the guise of medical necessity. In this section, I want to go over a couple of examples of self-experimentation throughout history. I'm totally fine with self-experimentation. As long as you agree to it, it's your idea, it's just you. You are the only person who's going to undergo this experiment, and you decided to do it. I'm all for it. Good for you. Our first honorable mention is Claude Barlow. In 1944, a researcher named Claude Barlow ingested over 200 schistosome worms to transport with him back to the US from Egypt in order to study whether or not domestic snails could also become infected and bring the disease to the US. Schistosomiasis is a very painful disease that is caused by parasites and the very worms Barlow ingested. Symptoms of the disease include vomiting, abdominal pains, nausea, diarrhea, bloody stools, and we can't forget anorexia. Before ingesting them, he attempted to send the snails infected with the disease via mail several times, but they kept dying. Knowing good and well that he could die from the disease, Barlow decided it was worth it, and he ingested them so that he could transport them back to the US. On his journey back to the US, he started to experience some pretty messed up symptoms. These symptoms include difficulty breathing, bloody urine, nausea, and we can't forget ejaculating eggs within his semen. Yay! Even though Barlow knew he could die, he refused treatment up until every single last egg came out of his semen and his urine. Good for you, Barlow. Our next and final honorable mention is Edwin Caskey. In Nebraska on November 25th in 1936, a doctor named Edwin Caskey injected deadly amounts of cocaine into his system to observe and record his observations as the drug took hold of his body in order to document the effects of cocaine. He knowingly and willingly made a sacrifice on his life so we had a better understanding of the effects of cocaine on the human body as someone overdoses. Caskey wrote his experience all over his office walls until he at some point overdosed and died. The unfortunate part about Caskey's self-experiment and his sacrifice to medicine is that no one could read what the hell Caskey wrote on his walls. When he was under the influence of the cocaine and he was trying to document all of his symptoms and side effects up until he stopped breathing, unfortunately he was writing gibberish, unbeknownst to him. So in the end, the information he wrote down was completely useless to us. That sucks. And that's the end of this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. And again, I know that I didn't cover every single major human experiment throughout history. You know, it's not feasible, not enough time. I don't want this to be a 3-hour video. I hope you enjoyed these ones, but if there is a human experiment that you want to mention in the comments below, please feel free to, especially if it's a little known experiment. And I also want to say that I know this was a really long video, but I wanted to upload a nice beefy one this time around because I am going to have surgery in a few days. For anyone who cares, it's not a serious surgery. It's not really crazy. It's kind of sort of minor. I'm hoping to be able to upload a video again within the next couple of weeks. But just in case, I wanted to leave this nice long one here. So that's all for now. Until next time. Bye.